Thank you, everybody, for joining our webinar today. My name is Michelle Medea. I'm Director of Education and Partnerships with Second Nature, and we're delighted to have you with us this afternoon. A quick word of thanks to Altenex and all of our corporate partners for their ongoing support of Second Nature and the Climate Leadership Network. This webinar will be recorded. If you'd like a copy of the slides and the recording, please email Chris O'Brien directly for a copy. His contact information is at the end of the presentation. Just some housekeeping before we get started. We're going to have some time for Q&A at the end of the event, and you can submit questions at any time using the questions function on your GoToWebinar panel. We're going to hear from three presenters today. First, Chris O'Brien. Chris O'Brien came to Altenex from American University, where he was Director of Sustainability from 2009 to 2015. He was responsible for all sustainability functions, including the university's commitment to achieving climate neutrality by the year 2020. Chris continues to teach about energy, climate, carbon markets, and sustainable purchasing in the Sustainability Management Program at American University's School of Business. At Altenex, Chris is the Director of Higher Education Programs, sharing what he learned at AU with other colleges and universities across North America, helping the higher education sector catalyze the transformation of America's electricity supply chain to clean and renewable sources. Next, we'll hear from Paul Schuster. Paul joined Altenex in July 2016 and oversees the execution of Altenex's growth strategies, focused on bringing to market innovative structured financial products and analytics packages that continually help Altenex customers better manage their energy programs. Paul's background is in capital project finance and risk management. He came to Altenex after being the founder and CEO of the Tri-Montaigne Group, a consultancy in Boston that helps multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects manage and control capital risks during initial project financing. But first, we're going to start off by hearing a few opening remarks from Tim Carter, President of Second Nature. Prior to coming to Second Nature a little over 2 years ago, Tim was the founding director of Butler University's Center for Urban Ecology. He also served as a faculty member at the University of Georgia, where he received his PhD in ecology. So Tim, over to you, and I do encourage everyone to ask questions throughout the broadcast, and we'll save them until the end. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm going to give some quick national organizational context to this webinar, and I will say from the outset, apologies to those of you who came last week to our webinar series, and this is going to be a little bit redundant. But at the same time, thanks for coming to both. After I'm done, which is really just organizational, then I'm going to turn it over to Chris to get into the meat of the content. I think it's important to kind of set the stage, particularly in this era of alternative facts, that there are, in fact, real scientific data to support our work. We all can reference the National Climate Assessment. Actually, another webinar happening right now about the National Climate Assessment, but this is data from the National Climate Assessment showing modeled and actual climate data. And clearly, this issue of climate is real. And actually, next slide, the most important or succinct way of thinking about it is in these 5 bullets, I think, that Ed Maibach has described. 1, that it's real. That's what the data shows. 2, that it's us. 3, that experts agree. 4, it's bad. And 5, there's hope. A lot of times we focus on one of these 5. I actually think there's a lot of reasons to focus on all of them all at once. You don't want to have naive optimism, but at the same time, number 5 is really important. There is something we can do about it, and I know a lot of our webinars are focused on the solutions, the climate solutions that are out there. Next slide. And it's not only the experts that agree, but in the past couple of years, we've had religious communities weigh in. Next slide. We had the landmark international agreement at Paris, many of you are familiar with, and that has really set a context here within the U.S. about a response to an administration that might, well, not might, but has expressly not been friendly towards climate work at the international scale. Next slide. And so the real elephant in the room is around what will happen to climate leadership under the new Trump administration. It's kind of worth mentioning at this point. There is a lot that's still unknown, but things are becoming clearer, particularly as budgets are starting to be released. We do see the priorities at the on the executive branch side are what was expected. not just what was speculated about, but these new proposals coming out, like defunding of the EPA or really slashing DOE's budget around some of the innovative energy initiatives. These are real battles that are going to be challenging, that actually it's not going to take just the higher ed sector to speak into, but it's going to take a collection of sectors to speak into, and we are seeing that happen. We're actively involved in that, and many other business, healthcare, municipalities are all speaking into the importance both of climate action and of clean energy or innovative energy at a variety of scales. And so again, thinking back those 5 bullets, there is hope, and there's still a lot of work to do. So we don't want to dwell on the elephant, but we have to acknowledge that it's there. Next slide. In some ways, some of that hopeful condition actually comes from under the worst case scenario, or some of the bad scenarios, what's actually going to happen. So this is comparing coal production, coal consumption under a clean power plan or no clean power plan option. And you can see, even without the clean power plan, which is a pretty likely scenario, the clean power plan is not going to exist in a form that it was proposed under the Obama administration. You're not seeing a large, radically spiking increase in coal. Coal is really an industry on the way out. The new energy systems do not rely on coal extensively, either domestically or internationally, and in the future. And so future investments are not going to be in coal-related infrastructure. Next slide. Additionally, obviously, many people know this, there's a lot of growth in the renewable energy sector. This is just showing megawatts of solar in the 10 years between 2005 and 2015. So it's gone from 79 megawatts in the US in 2005 to 7,000 megawatts in 2015. And as much as Altenex has great data and analytics that support everything they do, I would argue in 2005, they wouldn't have projected that you had this level of increase in the renewable energy deployment within the US. No one was predicting this level of growth. And so the market has really spoken around renewable energy. Next slide. And then we're also seeing innovations in the way the grid itself operates. So there's many more distributed energy systems beginning to go in. The technology is there for that. Here's just an example of NYU's microgrid under the blackout conditions of Superstorm Sandy. That's a much more common type of energy system that we're starting to see implemented more. So the whole model around how we get our energy and the centralized nature of it that has been the past doesn't necessarily then mean that's how it will always continue to be in the future. Next slide. So the takeaway here is that we really have to be careful, particularly under the new administration, of what we're focused on. One thing we could be focused on is getting the orthodoxy right. You know, if everyone just believed man-made climate change was real, then we would see actions change. Clearly, that's not going to be the case. And so if you're focused on the outcomes instead, you may be able to find alignment. And this is something, you know, you have to be savvy about, alignment on some of the shared objectives that you could work on in the short term. For instance, job creation, if you want to talk about the best place to invest in new job creating programs, it's not in the fossil fuel industry. It's in the building retrofit and industrial efficiency industry. So it's just there's some smart decisions you can make using a different type of framing and get the outcomes that everyone might want. Next slide. There's another way of saying the same thing. About a month ago, there was this headline in the New York Times talking about how farmers in the Midwest are actually talking about climate solutions. So how using the term climate. And when I was in Indianapolis for 5 years, the city had one of the largest electric vehicle fleets in the country, a car share, actually, this French company. And the mayor never mentioned climate change. It was always energy security, innovation, and job creation, from the practices that they put in place. So outcomes were happening even though the orthodoxy was different. So that's kind of the background for the the cultural or social context we find ourselves in now. And so I just want to flip next slide into more of an organizational context that I wanted to talk through, and just mention how Second Nature is really responding to this changing environment we find ourselves in. When we look at the conceptual landscape of higher ed, we know many of you that are on the call are actually implementers. You work getting stuff done on your campus, and you're already highly networked with each other, whether it's through whatever professional network you're a part of. If you're a sustainability staffer, it might be HE. If you're a facilities manager, it might be APA, or a finance person. There's tons of NACUBO and other organizations. There's a lot of networks of implementers that happen. Presidents, however, are not as well connected functionally, and so this leads to really different roles depending on where you sit within the university. Next slide. And so Second Nature, recognizing this difference, and we have to recognize that actually our support, the Climate Leadership Network, is a small slice of what exists within higher education, which is a group of highly networked individuals as well as a group of senior leaders. And so we need to support not everyone in higher ed, first of all, but those that are committed to aggressive climate action. And then we do a number of things. In our current form, we provide access to resources from outside of higher ed. We work directly with signatories on their own individual campuses, maybe a little too much actually in trying to connect people because people are so well connected already. But we definitely provide specific resources for people to get things done. Then we also connect presidents to each other and then to implementers. And within higher education, we've historically spent time recruiting institutions to get into the network by signing one of the commitments. So this is kind of how we've currently operated. Next slide. So after 10 years of the commitments, the network's really now positioned to grow, not through that recruitment effort anymore, but really through the performance of signatories. And so our focus is really shifting to 4 areas. You notice the icon has gotten bigger in 4 different areas. And this is where we're, as an organization, really going to spend our time and our resources and energy in these areas. And so one of the things you'll notice is direct recruitment from within higher education has gotten smaller, and then these nodes into and out of the sector have gotten larger. I'm going to walk through these 4 really quickly, the 4 changed large icons. Next slide. So the first 2 areas actually are internal to the network. First, while presidents do connect with one another, they're not as highly networked together, functionally networked together as the implementers. And so we at Second Nature need to do a better job of making that happen. And this happens through in-person convenings like the summit we just had, through public-facing initiatives like state advocacy or policy, and then things like the shared leadership statements that at the federal level we created in response to the changing administration. So there are things that the presidents can do together collectively as presidents that are really important, and we can help facilitate. Next slide. Second area is to find more intentional ways to connect you as implementers with your senior leadership, with your presidents and chancellors. And this can happen through better communication about how your efforts are advancing the strategic goals of the institution, or finding ways that the presidential influence can actually overcome some of the barriers you might currently be facing. So both of those ways, just 2 examples of ways in which we can help bridge what can be a really large divide between implementation or implementers and the presidents. We're going to spend a lot of time helping bridge that gap. The next 2 areas really relate to our role into and out of the sector. And so the third is to really tell the story of what the network itself is doing, the innovative work that's happening, the collective work that's happening, the scaled work, and then represent that climate leadership externally with other sectors that are interested in the same thing, the business community, the healthcare sector, municipalities, state governments. All these other entities are really doing critical work to advance what we all share to be important, which is accelerated climate action. We can spend more time and do a much better job of reaching outside of the sector to drive progress forward. And then lastly, the last slide, click down here, is really to look at resources from the outside. And that gets us to the point of this webinar. So it's one example of how we can bring folks that work within higher ed, but then also outside of higher ed for driving important action within the Climate Leadership Network. This can be technical assistance like today, or external funding. In 2016, we brought in about $1.5 million external to the network to support the work of the network happening. Next slide. So let's turn quickly to just the topic at hand, and Chris is going to talk a lot more about this, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it. All carbon commitment signatories, many of you on the webinar might be a signatory. You have a carbon neutrality goal, and to get there, you have to actually address different ways of solving this carbon emissions equation. And there are three main buckets that we talk about a lot: energy efficiency and conservation, fuel switching or scaled renewable energy procurement, and then some level of carbon offsets. And different campuses have done different versions of using all three of these buckets as tools to mitigate their carbon emissions. Particularly that third bucket can shrink and grow over time. Hopefully it shrinks to zero, and you don't need offsets to meet your goals. But this webinar is really focused on that second option. Next slide. And we know that that second bucket, that renewable energy bucket or fuel switching, it can't just happen at small scales. Although it is important, many campuses have some renewable energy on site. But in order to meet your goals, it has to happen at larger scales. And so we have partners that are real experts in this area. Last week, Customer First Renewables talked about aggregated renewable energy procurement and projects in that regard. And this week, you actually hear from Altenex about this really innovative offering that in some ways is the other side of the coin from aggregation, and still at scale. It's not these aren't small scale projects, even though it's not an aggregated project. It's actually a really interesting way in which we can use the economies of scale, but apply it potentially to smaller institutions or smaller consumer demands. But this is a really critical part of meeting your goals that you've set out for yourself. And we couldn't do this without partners like Altenex. They're the experts, and they have options for you that we really get excited about, and then we're glad that they can share with you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris O'Brien from Altenex. We'll dig into this further from the technical side. Chris, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tim. Actually, I like that you ended with that slide. That slide was actually, well, as Michelle mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, I worked at American University where I ran our Office of Sustainability, and that last slide that Tim just showed was from the large offsite solar PPA that we did while I was there. And so I faced a lot of the challenges that we're going to talk about in the rest of the webinar, and those challenges are what has led to Altenex creating this new style of PPA that will help speed and address a lot of the challenges of campuses who are pursuing large-scale off-site renewable energy solutions. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So some of this is probably old news to most of you on this call, so I'll try to tailor this. But just briefly, why renewables to begin with? Specifically, why large-scale off-site renewables? The main reason is one that I know that we undervalued when we did our deal at AU, which was the risk management benefit of having a long-term contract that has a fixed price. The risk that avoids is the fluctuation, the unpredictable fluctuation, and eventually rising costs of conventional electricity that we're all exposed to when we're buying grid-delivered electricity in short-term contracts. Having a renewable energy PPA from a project allows you to avoid that exposure to price risk over the long term. Secondly, because renewables are now competitive, you can actually see cost savings in addition to avoiding that risk. And third, the reason why, what has brought most of us to this conversation to begin with, certainly those of you who are signatories, is that, and to Paul's opening points about climate change, clearly sourcing renewable energy is critical to meeting our climate change goals, and addressing the sustainability concerns, especially among our student populations. Next. So what is renewable energy doing in the U.S.? This slide is just a demonstration of just how far both solar and wind costs have dropped in the last 8 years or so. You can see, back in 2009, solar was at least a factor of 10 more expensive than it is today. And as wind and solar have both dropped in price, the blue bars represent the growth in renewable energy contracts. So you can see an obvious uptick in renewable energy sourcing as the resources have become more cost effective in the marketplace. Next. So that was a U.S. snapshot, U.S.-wide. This slide is a snapshot of what campuses are doing in higher ed. So the tall blue bars are the number of campuses that are purchasing what we call unbundled RECs. A lot of people just use the term RECs to refer to this strategy. In truth, all three of the strategies that are on this slide include RECs. So I want to be clear that the tall blue bars are unbundled RECs, meaning when a campus just buys the certificates themselves as a way of helping to catalyze renewable energy development, but as a separate commodity from the energy. And the reason it's important to make that distinction is that it is by definition a net cost to the buyer. It doesn't provide the kind of risk mitigation or cost savings that the other two strategies provide. So the tall green bars are the number of campuses, and this data only goes through 2014, but it has continued to grow in 2015, is the number of campuses that have done on-site solar. And again, this is only those campuses that have retained the RECs associated with their projects. There are probably many more campuses that were only able to do their projects because they monetized the RECs in order to make the projects pencil out. The small blue bar is where we're going to focus on for the rest of the webinar, which is offsite PPAs. And what you're seeing here is, again, just the number of organizations that have done them as of 2014. So it's a very small number that have done large offsite PPAs, and that's part of some of the problems that have that have slowed the uptake of that strategy are the problems that we want to address with the PowerBloks product that we're going to talk about. Next slide. So just to cover both of those strategies a little bit, on-site projects, these are projects that we consider behind the meter, so they're offsetting the full delivered cost of electricity. In states that allow net metering, it means that any excess generation that goes back into the grid is credited, oftentimes at the full delivered retail rate. And you can bid out these on-site projects to get the most competitive bids. And if the market supports it, you can also retain the RECs. Offsite wind, offsite could be solar or wind. Generally, it's wind, but in my own personal background, the project we did at AU happened to be solar, but that's fairly unusual. The wind market is growing and very strong. Even in the current political environment, we don't see that changing. So one of the issues with wind projects is that they're very big. We're talking about hundreds of megawatts. And so we'll talk about why that's potentially a challenge for campuses. The prices from the electricity generated by these wind farms is now very competitive with other conventional, quote, brown sources of power. However, they're larger, they're typically much larger than the annual usage of a campus. Next slide. This is just a closer up view of the number of campuses doing on-site solar, but as you'll see in a minute, the number of campuses is different than the amount of renewable energy being generated by these projects. Next slide. Oh, and this is a list of all those campuses, and this will actually be updated soon on a website that we'll be able to share. Next slide. This is where it starts getting interesting, because while over 100 campuses have done on-site solar where they've retained the RECs, the annual energy generation on average of those projects is only about 1,500 megawatt hours, which is generally, you know, a very small portion. I know at AU it was about 1% of our annual electricity was generated by the on-site solar that we did. Next slide. So contrast that, and this is where I think it really gets interesting. The green line there is the annual solar generation from on-site solar. The blue line, if you remember in that earlier slide where there were only about 14 campuses that had done large offsite PPAs, it's a small number of campuses, but the average size of the renewable energy project is dramatically larger. So this slide is meant to demonstrate that, you know, while on-site solar is part of the solution, it maxes out pretty quickly and typically can only provide a small portion, especially for campuses that have ambitious climate goals. On-site probably isn't going to get you all the way there. Certainly not if you're an urban campus. But generally, it's very seldom that you'd be able to install enough on-site solar to make a large impact, both on your emissions as well as on your financial benefit of controlling your energy costs. Next slide. So here's where it gets complicated. Those large offsite deals, while they're large and can be very, very, very beneficial, the market is very big and relatively complex and generally not very user-friendly, to someone on a campus who's trying to make sense of, okay, how do I find a wind farm to do a PPA with? And this map here is a map that we generated internally at Altenex. The blue circles show wind projects and the yellow circles show solar projects, and these are utility scale projects. So we track all these projects in order to help campuses identify projects that are available to them. Next slide. The typical offsite PPA structure is, as you see in this image here, in the middle is the project, that's the wind farm. The campus on the right agrees to a PPA price with that project. That project then typically sells the electricity that they generate into their local wholesale market, and the difference between what they sell it for and what you agreed to pay for it is either a cost or a revenue to you as a campus. So the project delivers to you RECs from their generation, as well as the benefit of having a known fixed price for electricity in a long-term market, which generally speaking, reduces that risk exposure that we talked about at the beginning to fluctuating conventional electricity prices over time, and also, in the best circumstances, delivers a revenue to the campus which offsets the growing costs of its delivered electricity from its local supplier. Typically, these contracts are 12 to 20 years, which in some cases, that can be something that takes campuses a while to get their heads around. Generally, electricity contracts at the longest are 5 years, typically more like 2 or 3. So looking at a 12 to 20-year contract is new enough, that it can be an impediment to getting a deal done. Similarly, as I mentioned, the scale of these projects, the projects are typically looking for off-takers who are willing to take 50, 100, 200 megawatts of generation, and many campuses, may only need 10, 15, 20 megawatts of generation. Next slide. So those are the challenges that we've set out to try to solve as a company by developing a new product called a Powerblock. These challenges summarized here, the annual energy demand of many campuses is too small to attract a large number of competitive off-site PPA bids. The typical contract term of 12 to 20 years is longer than some campuses are willing to commit to. And so in order to get to scale, and this goes back to what Tim was talking about an aggregated strategy, we actually, I was part of an aggregated strategy, and we were able to get it done, but it took us several years to coordinate with our partners and get to the scale that the market was willing to respond to with competitive bids. So achieving that aggregated economy of scale is a problem that we're trying to solve with a Powerblock by achieving the benefits of scale while avoiding the need for coordination among various campus stakeholders. Another problem that we're trying to solve is the lag time between inking a PPA and a project being operational. So those are 4 of the challenges, and I'm going to turn it over to Paul, my colleague Paul, to talk about how we've designed Powerblocks to address these problems.
Appreciate that, Chris. Appreciate everybody joining us on the call today as well. I only have about 3 slides, but I find myself in the awkward position of presenting to a higher education group with some very, very dense slides, which I'm certain I'm going to get some grief from Chris about a little bit later. As Tim and Chris had both mentioned earlier, the challenge that we set out to address was how do we make utility scale renewable energy available to smaller institutions, smaller organizations, higher education campuses that don't need 100 megawatts of energy at a time. What we typically find for a wind project, for instance, is that you can meet your cost economics of scale at about 100 megawatts, but there are only a few institutions out there, like a Facebook or a Google, that would ever consume that much energy at a time. So the first question we had was, how do we start to either aggregate or break up this power into some form or fashion that would actually make sense for people? And from an aggregation standpoint, there weren't a lot of options available to customers out there in the marketplace. They could either tag along with one of those aforementioned technology companies and have the Googles of the world take 100 megawatts, and then have a campus take an additional 10 or so, whatever's remaining, if you will. But that wasn't very efficient because the project wasn't necessarily customized and perfect for the campus all the time. It wasn't necessarily meeting the right timing and the scheduling as to what the campus was looking for. But at least you had access to the renewable power. And then as Chris had mentioned, the other aggregation effort that people were going through was, well, okay, can we bring a consortium or a syndication of organizations together and try to get everybody walking down the same path at the same time, under the same terms, with the same view of the future, working at the same project with all the different people who have to sign off on the approval process to make that happen. So naturally, there are no risks to a project like that actually getting done. There's a ton of effort, a ton of time and resources put against something like that. So Powerblocks took a different approach. We said, wow, instead of trying to bring a whole bunch of customers together all at once, can we instead break up a project into smaller blocks and sell those blocks off at the time when a customer is willing to purchase them, and in a capability and in a way that makes it easy for them to digest. And that's really what Powerblocks does. So what I'm going to walk you through is how we got there and the mechanism that we use. It's a market-based mechanism. We rely upon a lot of third parties to get there. But at the end of the day, what popped out of this is a more standardized PPA product that is sized in smaller increments. It's sized in 10 megawatt increments so that we can affect, the right sizing and scaling for, smaller needs. It has a contract term of about 10 years. I'm sorry, let me take that about out. It's a contract term of 10 years, which is shorter than the 12 to 20 that is the standard norm out there in the industry, and is very attractive to organizations that may be reluctant to sign up for more than 10 years, depending upon what their own internal profiles look like. It does not require you to bring a whole bunch of different organizations together all at the same time. You come when you're ready to buy. And it's done with a counterparty that holds a AA- or better credit rating within the marketplace. So we understand that there's always a credit risk of going out and working with a project that's a LLC and having to post collateral. We think that there's a huge benefit for anybody who's looking at credit in terms of working with one counterparty. Now, would you mind going to the next slide, please? So here's my dense slide, and I do apologize for this, but I'm trying to get a lot accomplished with this particular diagram. Where in the past, what would end up having to happen is that we would basically do a bilateral agreement between one project and one buyer, or in a few rare cases, maybe 2 or 3 buyers who can all agree to the same terms. The PowerBlock marketplace instead creates an intermediary into the middle, if you will, right? And that marketplace is made up of organizations who are willing to warehouse and inventory the power over a certain amount of time in exchange for some benefits that they receive. But what it does is it allows the power buyers to come to that marketplace similar to coming to a storefront, where you can come in and you can say, oh, okay, Mr. PowerBlock provider number 1, what sort of projects do you have today? 10 megawatt increments, 10 years on the term. It allows you to come and do it on your time frame and do it on your schedule, versus having to have everything close at the exact same time so that the project can go out and get financed in the first place. So really what happens here is that the project goes ahead and signs up into the PowerBlock marketplace. They coordinate and sign a deal with a single counterparty within that marketplace. Say it's a large financial institution. That financial institution now has 100 megawatts worth of power that they're going to hold on to for up to a year, or until that project is commercially operable. And now we bring our clients, we open up access to smaller corporations, higher education institutions, municipalities, organizations that want to participate, where we can say, here's an inventory of what's available. You can now sign a bilateral agreement with that financial institution, like I said, a AA- or better, where you can take off 10 megawatts worth of that power, similar to a PPA in every regard and fashion. It would have been had you signed it directly with the project to begin with. In fact, you can trace it all the way back to the project so that you can accomplish any sort of additionality requirements that you have, any sort of rec auditing that you may have. You can actually do settlement auditing so that you can track the financials and the cash flows associated with it if you wanted to. But because that financial institution has stepped in there to warehouse that risk for you, they are providing a very valuable service that creates this virtual storefront of PowerBloks. We think it's a really unique evolution and innovation within the marketplace. We like it because We think it addresses many of the concerns. Not all. I wish we had a silver bullet. Perhaps this is a brass bullet of some type. But what it does is it does address shorter terms. It addresses shorter or smaller increments of power, and it provides a more standardized way of purchasing the power, so that we can address some of the customization and commercial terms that tend to be very hotly contested at times, depending upon the organizational challenges that you have internally. So with that, let's move on to the next slide. In this particular case, I really wanted to make the case as to how our customers are using PowerBloks today. So far, we've run about 180 megawatts through the PowerBlock structure. We currently have another 200 or so being actively negotiated right now. So you can imagine what this allows us to do is, instead of signing up 2 organizations at 100 megawatts apiece, we can expand the marketplace out there for customers who are able to and willing to participate in renewable energy purchases. And we think that it's really going to change how quickly this market really grows. Within this, purchasing offsite generation, it really has 3 big drawbacks, as we mentioned. Certainly the size to get to the cost scale. The correlated output is interesting because your campus may or may not be directly located near one of those settlement hubs that a project would have been settling at to begin with. And then there's the flexibility in timing, which, trying to bring a whole bunch of different syndicated organizations together at the same time is very, very challenging and very difficult. So the Altenex PowerBloks, it's not only a financial product, it does support the new build of different assets. It's sized to those smaller company needs. We find that, for some of our organizations where they want to dip their toe in, or they want to have something a little bit more correlated to what exactly their regional needs are, it provides that. And then, frankly, there's a flexibility in timing, as I mentioned, because of this warehousing capability. So we really think about PowerBloks as a very innovative structure. We're excited about what it can do next. We're excited about how we think it's gonna at least change the conversation around aggregation, and how organizations want to think about their renewable energy purchases. And we think that it's just going to be yet another tool in the toolbox for organizations to consider as they go forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to the organizer, and I think that we have questions coming at this point.
Thanks, everybody. This is Michelle again. Thanks so much for the presentations. And we do please encourage the attendees to submit questions. We have about 15 minutes left here. And Chris, I think I want to start this question with you, since you're closest to the campus experience. What would you recommend be the first steps for someone at a campus to take to explore PowerBloks as an option for them?
Sure. Well, that's easy, and perhaps I have a biased answer, but basically just reach out to me, and we can go through this deck in a lot more detail, especially on the structure of the PowerBloks, so that someone investigating this can understand. Paul is right. I'm going to run them through the ringer on the density of those slides, but it's really just a testament to the fact that this is innovative. So it's we want to try to simplify the structure, and so understanding that structure in simple terms is something that we're very willing to have those conversations to make sure that it's clear. But more generally speaking, I would just say, having gone through this, getting your stakeholders involved early on, and identifying who's going to be key in your decision-making process. It's good to do that early, because it's a long process, and you want to make sure you know what the concerns are that any of your decision makers are going to have, so you can address those early in the process.
Speaking of timing, how would you estimate, so for the customers, your customers that have gone through this, and I'm sure it varies depending on the size and type of organization and their goals, what is the estimated timeline from start to finish of executing one of these agreements and then seeing the benefits of that on your campus?
Sure, that's a great question, and I'll offer Paul to jump in too, but there's the part of the equation, the time equation that we can control through our work at Altenex, and there's the component of the time equation that belongs to the campus. And so on our side of the equation, as Paul said, once there is project inventory, being warehoused by this financial institution, it's good for a year and it's just sitting there. So the transaction, one of the problems that I should have mentioned earlier that this solves is the soft costs associated with identifying, analyzing, structuring, and negotiating a PPA, which can take a very long time. With a PowerBlock, it's like an off-the-shelf type solution. It's 10 megawatts, 10 years, pre-negotiated terms and conditions. So it's ready to go. So that the time factor is really more about the work that you have to do within your campus to involve your stakeholders, get their concerns raised and addressed, and just educate everyone about the options that are available, and create your decision-making criteria so that you can get a decision made internally. And one of the best ways I've seen that one of our customers did, that was a higher ed client, they pre-scheduled decision-making meetings with all of their stakeholders on what I think it was maybe a 3 or 4 month timeline, where once they had engaged us, they had already literally blocked out on the calendar with the decision makers meeting times where the agenda was predetermined. They knew, having worked with us, what the agendas were going to be, and they literally scheduled all those meetings in advance. And that was the best way I saw, to get ahead of the problem of inertia in the decision-making process.
Great. What about schools that don't even need the 10 megawatt block? Are there solutions for them? Can they split that block with other campuses?
Well, Paul, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. So absolutely, there are different options out there. We can certainly aggregate together to try to accommodate those 10 megawatt blocks. Not all of the projects that we work with come in nice, discrete, increments of 10 to begin with. In fact, we had a project that came in at 178 megawatts. So there's always, going to be some smaller quotient that we can work with depending upon what the financial institution does. It adds a little bit of complexity to change it from the standard. We would very much like to keep it as standardized as possible. To Chris's point, it reduces a lot of the soft costs and the issues associated with kind of deviating from that. But I think what I would like to stress is we'd like to work with a customer to try to figure out how to make it work, and I'd be reluctant to say no.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I'll emphasize that, while we're talking about aggregation as a problem, it doesn't mean that it can't work. It's one barrier that we want to try to remove. But if you're dealing with limited options and you can't do 10 megawatts, then sure, there's no reason why we can't try to group you together with another campus. The other solution, again, not wanting to sound like I was poo-pooing on-site solar, I was only highlighting the challenges associated with it, but it is a solution. And so for a campus that is small enough that even 10 megawatts would be too large, maybe on-site is a bigger solution for you. And if it is, we do that too. We help campuses do on-site solar. In fact, we're working with a whole host of campuses right now through ASHE on-site solar. So we're happy to look at that as a solution too.
Thank you. So do these, there's a question here about how these projects would be treated in the Second Nature Greenhouse Gas Reporting Protocol. And we'll confirm, we'll look into that. Chris, you might have some thoughts on that, since I'm sure you've worked so closely with our systems. And would these meet the additionality criteria? Is that something you want to talk about, or should we just, we can look at it ourselves and follow up with participants on the question, unless you have any particular thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, I can give an easy answer, and it is something that can have a long discussion. But the easy answer is that this is no different from the other existing solutions in terms of greenhouse gas accounting. As long as you retain the RECs, this is standard GHG accounting. You'd follow the same protocol that you're following now, which is the Scope 2 guidance from WRI that people generally agree is the best practice. There are two different ways of accounting for offsite RECs, one being financial and one being geographic, and so there's simple in-place practices for that. Philosophically, you can open that up and discuss, whether the existing best practice is the right approach. But that's a conversation that I'm happy to have with you at a conference sometime.
And then just to add a little bit color around the additionality question, we get that a lot regarding this because there is that intermediary in the middle. Keep in mind that the intermediary, the financial institution, exists to help transfer the power from the project to the end customer. They're not actually taking it themselves, and by providing kind of that lubrication in the system, they're opening up a marketplace that would not otherwise exist. In fact, we make the argument that many of the projects that participate within this Powerblock structure have had trouble finding corporate offtake on a large scale because there are just so many Googles and Facebooks of the world to begin with. Whereas what we're doing is we're opening up a marketplace and we're creating a capability for more projects to get developed, for more participants to play. And as long as that marketplace continues to thrive, then participants will play. If additionality, if the end user were to walk away, then we would not have a financial institution that would sit in the middle and the project would not get built. So similar to a developer who has a long-range plan to build a whole bunch of different projects over time, we want to make certain that we're seeding the industry, that we're creating a way for everybody to be economic and creating that additionality because of that.
This might build on that concept a little bit. Chris, as you know, schools are always interested in keeping things local to the extent that they can. So within the structure and within these potential projects, to what extent can a campus prioritize a local project or development? And if it's not in their direct community, what about their state?
Yeah, that's a question that we get all the time. And the thoroughly unsatisfying answer is it depends. It's simply, the answer is going to be relative to where you are, because the market is different everywhere. So, it's going to be a one-on-one conversation with each campus, both in terms, because what's local? When I was at AU, I came up with my own rule of thumb, frankly, without even talking to anyone. My personal feeling was I'd like a project that was within a day's drive of campus so that I can take stakeholders to see it. And that was not necessarily driven by, well, I can tell you it definitely was not driven by any understanding of the marketplace and the economics of the marketplace. It was purely driven by my own, ignorance of the marketplace combined with my interest in having something that was, quote, local. So how you define local, it could be whether you can get to the project, or it could be defined by state boundaries, or it could be defined by more from a financial feasibility standpoint. And this is something that we model and we dig into a lot. I would say local would be defined by the wholesale market that you're in and that the project is in, and that's something that I wouldn't have even known what that sentence meant back when I did a project myself. But so that's probably the definition of local that I would say is the most relevant to the viability of doing a deal like this, and that's something that takes a longer conversation to explain. But I would say that's the best test.
Can I just add to that? This is Tim, real quick. Oftentimes, I feel like that question gets asked in isolation of all the other factors that you're considering. And so while local may be the number one and only priority you have for a project, you probably also have a number of other considerations, and economics being another major one. And so it's easy to ask it in isolation, but also know that there's a bundle of priorities that you're going to have, and you're going to have to consider trade-offs in all these really important larger scale initiatives, and that might be one of them. What you consider as local, or what you initially thought as local, might be a little bit different once you understand the context and the conditions like Chris is describing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, to put it in procurement terms, I would say, going into it, setting up your own criteria, think about it in terms of requirements versus preferences. And, is it a requirement that it be within a certain regional, local boundary, or is it a preference? And if it's a preference, you think about, once you see what's available, think about what you might be willing to pay for that preference, versus whether, the decision making is going to be driven primarily or maybe exclusively by the financial benefits. And if it's going to be driven purely by the financial benefits, then maybe your circumstances allow to meet a local preference as well, but maybe they don't. And if they don't, we'll help you identify that in the process. But I would say more often than not, get prepared for thinking about the trade-offs that you might have to make.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question, and we're close to wrapping it up here. For a school with an existing PPA, would adding this PowerBlock option be a viable one for them?
Yeah, I'll invite Paul to opine as well, but I think if you have the capacity for it, in other words, if you're, I would say that's actually almost an ideal scenario, because having a portfolio approach is the best of all worlds, because it's the best way to limit risk. So absolutely, if you have the load to add another deal, this would be a great way of reducing additional risk and balancing that with another PPA.
Yeah, let's be very cautious that we don't double up on the existing load. So if you only really have 10 megawatts of load to begin with, let's not go out and buy 30 or 40 megawatts of PPAs. Similar to the fact that we don't encourage our customers to buy a long-term renewable PPA and then go out and do physical, renewable hedging on the physical markets for 1 to 3 years. All you're really doing is just incurring additional costs and creating risk because of that. But if you have the capacity, it gives you a way to diversify. It gives you a way, where possible, to get a little bit more localized power, and gives you a lot more flexibility as well.
Okay, last question, and then we're going to wrap it up. Tell us a little bit more about how you deal with schools or customers in states where power is relatively inexpensive. What's the appeal here, and how can we drive those schools towards more renewable energy when it's already pretty cheap?
Do you want to take that, Paul? I can, either way.
Yeah, so it's a very good question. In fact, many of the markets that we operate in, power is very inexpensive right now. In fact, I'd say that in most of the markets, we've seen about a 10 to 15% drop in the cost of price of power just over the course of the last 4 months. A lot of that's being driven by gas. A lot of it's being driven by renewable energy that's coming onto the grid that's very, very cheap. What we have seen, and the reason why this market is so attractive to so many different organizations, is that renewable power today, primarily, if you're looking at it from an economic standpoint, primarily offsite wind, will compete head-to-head with any cheap power that you could purchase through a utility or through a competitive retail energy provider that exists today. In fact, down in Texas, for instance, wind power today is setting the margin for electricity prices because it's cheaper than gas. So this gives you an opportunity to participate not only in something that's really great for the climate, but participate in something that's going to be economically beneficial for everybody.
Great. This is Michelle again. I want to thank Paul and Chris and Tim for their participation today. And thanks, of course, to all of you for listening with us and for continuing to do all the good work that you do to support climate action in higher education. And we will follow up and be back in touch with you with contact information and additional materials. And thank you again for your participation. Have a good day, everybody.